What's up everyone, I'm Chirag and welcome to this hands-on video, and this video covers various authorization techniques supported by Amazon HTTP API like IAM Authorization, Lambda Authorization, JWT Authorization, and apart from that you will also learn about how you can validate JWT access token at the end of this video. So guys, before we get started, I'm assuming that you already have a fair idea about Amazon HTTP API, but if not, then you can refer my tutorial series on Amazon HTTP API, which is mentioned in the video description. So let's get started. What's up everyone, I'm Chirag and welcome to part 11 of the tutorial series on AWS HTTP API Gateway. So guys, in this tutorial I'm going to take you through on how we can enable IAM authorization within HTTP API Gateway, and we will also see that how we can secure the API endpoint using the same. So let's get started. So before we dive into the practical implementation, let's try to understand this question. So why do we always see the option for authorization or section for authorization and not for authentication within any API or any API testing tool that we use like Postman? So here I would like to shed some light on authorization versus authentication. So let's try to understand it with an example. So let's say you are renting a car, and to rent a car you need to provide the identity proof and the down payment as a part of the formality. And once that formalities is done, you are authenticated to enter into that car. So that's basically authentication. Now once you are authenticated, you are authorized to drive that car and you can use the functionality of the car, but you are not authorized to modify that car, or you cannot resell the car because you are not authorized to do that. So that's basically authorization. So authentication is like entering into someone's home, and authorization is like what you can do and what you cannot do in their home. So for example, if you visit someone's home, you are authorized to sit in the living room, you can use the washroom, but you are not authorized to go into their bedroom, right? Because it's personal, because you are not authorized to do that in someone else's home. So that's basically the idea behind authentication and the authorization. So now if we talk in terms of API, then we already have the invocation URL or the address of the resource that we want to access. And once we have that invocation URL or the address of the backend functionality, all we do is we try to invoke that API endpoint or the invocation URL. And once you try to invoke that API endpoint, what API will do is it will check whether you are authorized to access that resource or the backend functionality or not. So that's the reason we see authorization in terms of API rather than the authentication. So however, authentication will anyways happen as a part of the first step. So let's say for example, you're trying to invoke the API endpoint using some basic authentication like username and password, or you're trying to invoke the API endpoint using some other authentication method like OAuth 2.0 or something like that. So what will happen once you try to invoke that API endpoint using that authentication method? Right, so the very first step or the very first thing that API will do is it will check whether the credentials you are passing are correct or not. So if the credentials are valid, then you will be able to access that resource, or you will be able to invoke that API endpoint successfully. And if that credentials are incorrect, then you would not be able to access that resources, right? So that's basically authentication. So within API, authentication is anyways happening as a first step, and then we have the authorization. So I hope I was able to explain between authentication and authorization in terms of API endpoint. So now we will get started with the IAM authorization within HTTP API. So guys, let's get started. So the very first thing that we need to do is open the HTTP API. So in my case, it's HTTP API itself. And once you are there, you need to click on routes. And once you are within routes, you need to decide which method you want to authenticate. So which method of which resource you want to authenticate, because it is not like we can authenticate every method or every resource in a single configuration. So you need to explicitly select. So for example, I want to authenticate this get method of this /test resource, then I need to select that, and then I need to say attach authorization. And similarly, you need to do for each and every method of the resource which you want to authenticate. Right, so for this tutorial, we are going to authenticate or enable IAM authentication for the get method under /test resource. So I'm going to select that and I will say attach authorization. And once you are there, you need to select the existing authorizer from this drop down saying IAM, which is built in. And once you select that, you need to click on attach authorizer. Now here we have did the configuration, and if you want to deploy it to the manual stage, then you need to say deploy and select the manual stage, that is version 1 in my case, and we will say deploy to stage. Now it was a very simple step to enable IAM authorizer. Now let's go to stages and try to invoke this API endpoint. So I'm going to copy this invocation URL and I will paste it over here. I will use version 1 stage followed by the test resource. And the method is get, and we will simply say send. So now as you can see, it returns status code 403, that is forbidden, and the message as forbidden. So when we use IAM authentication, we need to sign in or authenticate this request with signature version 4 signing process. So to do that, we will go back to the console, click on services, navigate to IAM management console. And once you are there, click on users from the left panel. So here we are going to create a new user. So we will say add user, give the username, I will say test. And we want to provide the programmatic access. So to sign in the request with a signature version 4, we will require access key and secret key. So that's the reason we will give or provide the programmatic access, and we will say next permission. So here it's a good idea to use a group for the permission, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we will attach existing policy directly. So here what we want is, we want API invoke. So we want to attach Amazon API Gateway invoke full access. So this will provide the invocation rights to this user. And say next tags, add a tag if you want, say next review, and finally click on create user. Now once the user is created, it will prompt for the access key ID and the secret access key. So you need to download .csv file, which will contain basically the secret key and the access key. So now I'm going to open this CSV file. So let me quickly pull that in. So here what we have, here we have the access key and the secret key. Apart from that, we have username, password, and the login link. So this is the access key and secret key that we are going to use to sign in the request with AWS signatures. So now to sign in the request, we will go back to Postman, click on authorization over here. From the drop down, say AWS signatures, and it will ask for the access key and the secret key. So I'm going to copy this access key, copy, paste, and then I will copy and paste the secret key over here. And finally, it's asking for the AWS region for the advanced configuration. So we will say US East 1, and the service name is execute -API. And I think now we are good to reinvoke this API endpoint. So let's say send. And as you can see, it returned the status code 200 and the response message, that is get method invoked. So basically a successful authenticated request returns a 200 OK response code, and an unauthorized request, as we just saw, it basically returned the status code 403, which is forbidden response code. Right, so this is how you can use IAM authentication to access the API endpoint, and this is how you can limit the access to certain users. And another thing I want you to take note is that unlike REST API, resource policies are not supported for the HTTP APIs at this point of time, but resource policies are supported within REST API. So basically this is how you can use IAM authentication. Unlike in real scenario, you will be using some SDK, right? So guys, that's all for this section. In this section, I will take you through on how to configure or use Lambda Authorizer to secure our API endpoints. So guys, while we configure Lambda Authorizer, we basically get two options for the response mode, that is simple and the IAM policy. So let's quickly have a look at that. So I will open API gateway, I will click on authorization, I will select any method, and I will say create and attach an authorizer. So here within authorizer type, as we know that this tutorial is based on Lambda authorizer, so we are going to select the Lambda over here. And if we scroll down, then here you will be able to see the response mode. So here we have two options, that is simple and the IAM policy. So basically in this video we will look at the simple response mode, which will return a boolean value for the given user that he or she is authorized to access the said resource or not. And if we talk about the IAM policy, then that is something we will cover in the upcoming tutorial, correct? So guys, now before we start with the practical implementation, let's have a look at the workflow. So guys, as you can see on my screen, here I have two workflows. So the one workflow is without Lambda Authorizer configured, and the another workflow is with Lambda Authorizer configured. So while we don't have the Lambda Authorizer configured, the workflow or the invocation steps are pretty straightforward. So here we have the postman that we use to invoke or test the API endpoint. And once we configure the invocation details, we basically invoke the API and the request is being sent to the Amazon API gateway. And once the request is passed over there, the appropriate backend integration gets invoked or executed. So in my case, it's Lambda function. So basically Lambda function gets executed and the appropriate response is sent back to the Amazon API gateway. And from there, the response is being sent back to the client. So this is the very simple workflow without Lambda authorization. So now let's have a look at the workflow with the Lambda authorizations configured. So here again we have the postman, we configure the details for the invocation, and while we configure the details for the invocation, we are going to also pass the authorization header as a part of the header. So we will define authorization as the key and the secret token as a value. And once we configure that, the request is being sent to Amazon API gateway. Now as a second step, it's not going to directly execute the backend integration, but instead what it will do is it will check whether the said user is authorized to invoke or access the said resource or not, right? So the request would be passed on to the Lambda authorizer. Here it will validate the authorization header. So it will check whether the secret token that is being passed is valid or not. If it is valid, then it will return this response that is authorized as true. And apart from that, if you want to pass any additional parameter, then you can pass that parameters as a part of the context. And for example, if Lambda authorizer found that secret token is invalid, then what it will do is it will return is authorized as false. And again, if you want to pass any additional parameters as a part of the context, then you can define over here, correct? Now, for example, if we don't pass the authorization header, then what it will do is it's going to return is authorized as false. It means that the said user is not authorized to invoke the said resource that he or she is trying to invoke, correct? Now, let's say, for example, the Lambda authorizer return is authorized as true. It means the said user is authorized to access or execute that resource. And as a next step, the Amazon API gateway is going to invoke or execute the backend integration, that is Lambda function. And once that is executed, the appropriate response is sent back to the API gateway, and from that the response is sent back to the client. Now let's say, for example, the Lambda authorizer found the secret token as invalid and it returned is authorized as false. Now as we see that is authorized as false, then the API gateway is not going to execute the backend integration or the Lambda function, that is the third step. Instead it will return the error code saying forbidden or unauthorized, right? So now let's get started with the practical implementation. So what we are going to do is we are going to click on services. We will navigate to Lambda management console because we need to create the Lambda function for the authorizer. So we will say create function and we will give the function name. I will say Lambda auth, something like this, and I will select runtime as Python 3.8. I will choose the permission as the use an existing role. I will say Lambda -API gateway role, and I will say create function. Now once the function is created, here we need to write a code that will reflect the or that will return the boolean response that whether the given user is authorized or not, but we will configure this code at later point of time. Now let's go back to the API gateway and we will click on routes over here. So now let's say I want to authorize or set up the authorization for the get method under /test resource. So as you can see here, we already have the IAM built-in configured. So we are going to remove this. So this we have configured as a part of the previous tutorial. And once you remove that, so click on that method and here we will say create and attach an authorizer. Now within authorizer type, we will select Lambda function, give the authorizer name. I will say lam auth. And after that, the region is US East 1. We will select the Lambda function that we have just created. So I'm going to copy this Lambda function name and paste it over here. Select that Lambda function. Now within payload format version, we are going to select 2.0. We don't want to select the legacy one, that is 1.0. So we are going to move on with the latest payload format version, that is 2.0. Response mode, as we just discussed earlier, that we are going to select simple. We are going to disable the authorizer caching. We don't want to cache that. And then we have identity sources. So here, as we can see, here we have some value saying $request.header.authorization. So it's asking that what would be the key that you will be passing for the secret token, right? So we will say in the header that key as authorization and value as secret token. Now, for example, if you want to pass the key as authorization token and its value should be secret token, then you need to modify this. So you need to mention over here something like this, that is authorization token. So now in the header, you need to pass the key as authorization token and the value as the secret token. Okay, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we will leave it as it is. Now, apart from authorization, if you want to add any other identity source, then you can click on add identity source and add it over here. But for now, we will leave it as it is. And then we have invoke permission. So this basically grants the permission to invoke the Lambda function, that is Lambda auth, that we have just created. Okay, so you need to make sure that it's enabled. And finally, once everything is configured, click on create and attach. Now here we have successfully configured the Lambda authorizer. Now as a next step, we are going to deploy this to the custom stage. So say deploy, I will select version 1, that is manual deployment, and I will say deploy to stage. Now from the API endpoint perspective, we have configured everything that is required. Now we will move back to the Lambda function. So here we need to decide, we need to validate the secret token. So if the secret token is valid, then only we will allow that user to invoke the seed resource. Okay, so what we are going to do is here within to implement within Lambda underscore handler, we will say if event of headers. So we are going to look for headers. Within headers, what we are going to look at? We are going to look at authorization. Now, for example, if we look one more time over here, so I'm going to say edit authorizer. Now, if we have passed here authorization token, then what we need to do is in the code, we need to look for the authorization token, right? But in my case, I have kept it authorization. So that's the reason I'm going to mention authorization over here. Okay. Now within authorization, we will get the secret code. Now I will compare the value. So the secret value should be secret code, something like this, or it can be anything. Make sure you pass this as a part of the environment variable and you use the KMS to encrypt this environment variable, because secret code or secret token should not be visible like this and it should be fetched at the runtime. Now here we are checking that if authorization is double equal to secret code, then we want to allow that user. So we will say response equal to curly braces, and here we will say is into double quotes is authorized true. So if the secret code is matching, then we will authorize this user. And apart from that, if you want to pass any additional parameters, so we will say context, a dictionary, any other param, and its value. Okay. So this is basically for the authorized user. And then we will say else. If the condition is false, then we will say is authorized as false. Okay, and within the if condition, we will say return response. Similarly, in the else part, we will say return response. And we will remove the default return statement. Now, once this is configured, click on deploy. Now, if everything is configured correctly, then our invocation should work as expected. Now, as a next step, we are going to test this API endpoint. So I'm going to open Postman And in the meantime, I'm going to navigate to stages with an API gateway to copy the invocation URL. Here it is, copy. I will open a new tab. I will say paste it over here, and I want to invoke the test resource, and the method is get. So at this point of time, we are not going to pass any headers or any other thing. So we will simply say send, and it should return unauthorized. As you can see, the status code is 401 unauthorized, because here the condition is evaluated to false because we have not passed any authorization header. Now let's pass the authorization header. Authorization, and the secret key is secret code. Okay, I will say send. Now as you can see, it returns status code 200 because this condition evaluated to true, and it returned the response saying that this user is authorized as a value true. Correct? Now if I pass any other value apart from secret code, and if I say send, then it's going to say forbidden 403. So guys, this is how you can secure your API endpoints using Lambda Authorizer with simple response mode. Correct? So guys, that's all for this section. In the previous section, I have covered Lambda Authorizer, and we had used the simple response mode to secure the API endpoints. And now in this section, I will take you through on how to use Lambda Authorizer using IAM policy as a response mode to secure our API endpoints. So here we are going to use the same configuration that we have used or configured in the previous tutorial. So guys, now if you look at this flow that we have discussed in the previous tutorial, so if you look at the Lambda Authorizer, so in that case what was happening is that the Lambda Authorizer was returning the Boolean value that whether the given user is authorized or not to invoke or access the said resource, right? So that was using the simple response mode. So guys, now if we use the IAM policy as a response mode, then instead of this Boolean response, right, instead of this Boolean value, what Lambda Authorizer will return is, it will return the IAM policy. That is this one, which is highlighted in the blue color. So this is basically the standard policy where we have the principal ID, policy document, version, statement. So here we have to focus on these three things, that is action, effect, and resource. So action is basically what permission or what action you want to allow or deny. So here in our case, we want to maybe allow to invoke the API, and we want to deny to invoke the API, right? So that's why the action is kind of execute -API : invoke. And then we have effect. So effect will define whether to allow that action or not. So that is allow or deny. And then we have resource. So within resource, we have to define the ARN of the resource that we want to allow or deny to the user. And if you want to pass on any additional parameters, then you can pass it as a part of the context. So this is a very basic simple IAM policy that we are going to return from the Lambda Authorizer instead of the Boolean value, while we use the IAM policy as a response mode. Right guys, so let's get started. So I will navigate to API gateway. So here I have the HTTP API open. I will click on routes. So as I mentioned, here we are going to reuse the most of the configuration from the previous tutorial. So in the previous tutorial, we had configured the Lambda Authorizer for this get method under /test resource. So what we are going to do is we are going to select the get method, and we will say configure authorizer. So here we have all the details of the authorizer. Now we want to change the response mode, right? So this is the response mode that is being set to simple. Now we are going to click on edit authorizer. We are not going to touch anything except the response mode and the invoke permission, correct? So within response mode, we will select IAM policy this time. We are going to leave the identity sources, payload format version, Lambda function name, and the authorizer name as it is. Now here if you see within invoke permission, while I clicked on the edit authorizer, this is disabled. So we need to enable it so that we can grant API gateway permission to invoke the Lambda function that we have defined over here, that is Lambda auth. And once this configuration is done, you need to click on save. Now this configuration is saved successfully, and if you want to deploy it to the manual version, then click on deploy, select the manual stage. So that is version 1 in my case, and I will say deploy to stage. Now in terms of API gateway or the API endpoint, we have did all the configuration. If you want to refer that how we had configured this authorizer, then you can follow the part 12 video of this tutorial series. Now as a next step, we are going to modify the code within the Lambda function, that is Lambda auth, that we have configured or defined in the previous tutorial, because at this point of time, this Lambda function is returning the Boolean value. Now we need to configure this Lambda function to return the IAM policy instead of the Boolean value. So here we have the condition, that is if event of headers within authorization token double equal to secret code, then we want to allow if this condition evaluates to false, else we want to send the default response. So what I will do is I will just remove the else. So by default here we will deny the user to access the given resource, right? So I will say deploy. Now here I'm going to import UUID for setting the principal ID, UUID. Okay. Now as the next step, what we need to do is we need to modify this response. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this response, the Boolean response, and here I will define response equal to, I'm going to copy and paste this IAM policy. I will say copy and paste it over here. I will do some formatting. So here it is. Now I want to generate the principal ID dynamically. So principal ID is basically the user identification associated with the token sent by the client. But for now we are going to have it dynamic using UUID. So I'm going to say UUID dot UUID4 braces dot hex. Now then we have policy document version. We are going to leave it as it is. Statement. So within statement we have action. So the action that we want to define is the execute -API :invoke. So that looks good. Now here we are within the condition. If this condition evaluates to true, then we want to allow. Now to which resource we want to allow, so that is something we need to define over here. So ARN AWS execute API, then we need to mention the region ID. So region ID is going to be the US East 1 in my case. So that's the current region that I'm working in, US East 1. Then we need to mention the account ID. So I can get the account ID from here. So I'm going to copy this, maybe paste it over here. I will copy the account ID and I'm going to paste it over here, followed by the API ID. So now API ID we will get from the API gateways. So I'm going to click on this HTTP API, and then here you can see within API details we have the API ID. So I'm going to copy this and paste it over here. Then we have /stage, then the HTTP verb resource, child resource, right? So at this point of time, what we are going to do is we are going to have the wildcard over here. So we are allowing access to any stage, and within any stage we are allowing access to any resource, correct? So we will come back later and we will see how we can restrict to particular stage or particular resource. Okay, so this is for the allow. Now we want to also deny, right? So again I'm going to copy this, copy, comment this and paste it over here. Now here instead of allow I'm going to say deny. So by default we are going to deny, and if you want to pass any additional parameter then you can pass it as a part of the context. I'm going to leave it as it is. Now save this and we are going to say deploy. Okay, now we are good to test. So I'm going to copy the invocation URL, click on stages. Let's start with the default stage, copy, open Postman, paste it over here. I'll say test. Let's try to invoke it randomly. I'll say send. It says 401 unauthorized. Okay, looks good. And now we are going to pass the authorization header. So that's going to be the authorization. What was that we have defined over here? I think it's the authorization token. Yes, I'm going to copy this authorization token, and we are going to pass the valid code. So in my case I have defined the secret code as the valid code or the valid token, and we will say send. So now as you can see it returns status code 200. It means it's working fine and our authorization is working fine, correct? Now if I misspell this and if I say send, then it's going to say forbidden. Okay, looks good. Now at this point of time I can also invoke this resource using version 1 stage. So let's see, we are able to invoke this. Now what I want to do is I want to restrict the access to the specific stage. So to restrict the access to the specific stage, what we need to do is, so here within resource, after API ID, it's basically the stage name, okay, stage variable. So right now it's the wildcard. It means all the stages are allowed to the given user or all the stages are denied to the said user. So we are going to restrict it to the version 1. Same goes for the deny version 1. Now while we restrict it to version 1 stage, we should not be able to invoke the test resource using default stage. So now if I say send, so here we are using version 1 stage, it's working fine. Now if I want to invoke it using default stage and if I say send, then it's going to say forbidden. So here we have restricted the access to the version 1 stage. So in fact, while we deny for anything, we can say deny to all the stages. We don't need to modify the policy, or we don't need to explicitly define the resource that version 1, deny to version 1. So we will say by default deny to all the stages and all the resources. Okay. So guys, this is how you can restrict the access to specific stage. Now for example, you want to restrict the access to particular resource and the particular method. So in that case, what we can do is, so within resource, here we have the wildcard. So this will be followed by the particular method that you want to allow. If you want to allow all the methods, then you can mention wildcard over here. So let's say at this point of time, we want to allow get/test resource. So we want to allow the get method for the /test resource. And if test resource has any child resource, then you can specify next to the test, for example, child resource, right? But right now we don't have the child resource under test. So we are going to save this and say deploy. Now we are going to test this out. So here we have the version 1/test. So we are going to invoke it. So as you can see, it returns status code 200 and it's running fine. So now let's say I only want to allow the post method and not the get method for the /test resource. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this get with the post methods. So here I am saying that only allow version 1 stage and the post method for the test resource. Okay. So now we are going to deploy it and let's say send. So now as you can see, it returns status code 403, that is forbidden. Now if I want to allow all the method, then I can place a wildcard over here. Let's see what happens. Say deploy and I will say send. So as you can see, it's running fine, right? So if you want to allow everything, then you can place wildcard over here. So basically this API ID is followed by the stage name and stage name is followed by the method that you want to allow, that is the HTTP method. And then it is followed by the resource, and then that resource is followed by the child resource if you have any. Okay, so this is how you can restrict the access to specific stage, to specific method, and to specific resource. So guys, that's all for this section. In this section, I will take you through on how to configure and integrate JWT Authorizer within HTTP API using AWS Cognito User Pool Service. So basically JWT stands for JSON Web Tokens, and we will be using JWT Authorizer to secure our API endpoints. So guys, here we will be using AWS Cognito as the identity provider, but you can also use any other identity provider that issues access tokens and follow OAuth 2.0 standards. So now let's get started. So guys, as you can see on my screen, I have put this diagram together which basically demonstrates that how JWT Authorizer fits in the picture, and I will quickly walk you through this diagram. So as a part of the step 1, what happens is that the HTTP request is being made by the user to the API along with the appropriate method and the resource that he or she want to invoke, right, which will also include a JWT formatted access token as a part of the header, which would be provided by the token issuer. So here in my case, the token issuer is the Amazon Cognito, correct? Now as a next step, the API gateway will receive the request, and after that it will pass the access token to the JWT authorizer for validation. So as a step 2, the token would be with the JWT authorizer. Now JWT authorizer will decode the token and it will further execute the step 3, that is it will send the request to the issuer JWKS URI to fetch the public key. And here JWKS stands for JSON Web Key Set. So it will request the authorization server for the public key. Now, as a part of the step 4, the authorization server will send the public key to the JWT authorizer, right? And once JWT authorizer receives the public key, it will validate the token's algorithm and its signature using the public key received by the authorization server. And guys, at this point of time, only RSA based algorithms are supported. Okay, so I just want you to take note of that. And once the step 4 is completed, now let's assume that the validation of the access token is successful by the JWT authorizer. So after that, the JWT authorizer will confirm the API gateway to proceed because the token is valid, right? And once it confirms, the API gateway will invoke the backend integration, that is the Lambda function in my case, and that Lambda function will return the appropriate response back to the API gateway, and API gateway will return the response to the calling application, right? So that's how the overall flow works, and that's how the JWT authorizer fits in the picture. So guys, I hope that you got the overall idea that how JWT authorizer works and how it fits in the overall picture. So now it's time to start the implementation part. So I will navigate to API gateway and click on routes from the left panel. So here I want to set up or configure authorization for the get method under /test resource. So I'm going to select that and we will say attach authorization, and here we will say create and attach an authorizer. Within authorizer type, we are going to select JWT, and then we will have a look at the authorizer settings, that what all things we will require to set up this authorizer. So name, then identity source, then we will require issuer URL. So that is something that we will get from the AWS Cognito service while we configure the user pools. And then we have the audience. So audience is nothing but the client ID, and client ID is something we will get from the user pool. Correct. So before we go ahead and configure the authorizer over here, we need to configure the user pool within Amazon Cognito service, because this configuration is dependent on the user pool configuration. Correct. So before we go ahead and navigate to the Cognito service, let's have a look at the steps that we need to follow to set up the user pool. So the very first thing is that we need to create the user pool, which would be followed by the creation of the app client without client secret, because here we will not need client secret, which is followed by the creation of the domain name, correct, which we will be using to fetch the authorization code or the access token, which would be followed by the creation of the resource server or the configuration of the resource server. So if you want to use the custom scope, then you can configure resource servers. It's not mandatory, I think. And then we need to configure the app client settings, followed by the creation of the temporary user. Correct. So let's get started. So navigate to AWS Cognito, click on services, search for Cognito and click on that. And once you are here, click on manage user pools and click on create a user pool from the top right corner. Give the pool name. I will say API authorization, and we will say review defaults and say create pool. Now once the user pool is created, the next step is to create the app client. So click on app clients under general settings, and here click on add an app client. Give the client name. I will say auth client. Okay. And then we are going to uncheck generate client secret because we don't need the client secret, and I will leave rest of the option as it is. You can modify as per your requirement. And finally we will say create app client. So here we have successfully created the app client. Now as a next step, we need to create or configure the domain name. So click on domain name under app integration. So here we will be using Amazon Cognito domain, but if you want to use your own domain, then you can configure over here. So I'm going to enter the domain name. I will say API auth test 1, and I will see if it is available. This domain is available, and we can say save changes. Now once the domain name is configured, we are going to create the custom scope via resource servers. So click on resource servers under app integration. Click on add a resource server, give it a name. I will say res server, provide the identifier. I will say test, and then we can define the custom scope over here. So I will simply say test.read, and within description I will say read. You can add any other scope that you want, like write scope, correct? And we will say save changes once the custom scope are configured or defined. Now as a next step, we need to configure app client settings. So click on app client settings under app integration. Now here you will be able to see the ID that we have created as a part of the step 2, which is the client ID. Now under enabled identity providers, we are going to check Cognito user pool, and then we will provide the callback URL. So I will simply say https://google.com, but you can provide your own domain over here. And then we have the OAuth 2.0 configuration, where we have allowed OAuth flows, allowed OAuth scopes, and allowed custom scopes. So we will start with the allowed OAuth flows. Now within allowed OAuth flows, we have three types, that is authorization code grant, implicit grant, and client credentials. So guys, if you want to learn more about these flow, then I have covered this in part 3 video of the API gateway authorization tutorial series, as you can see on my screen. I will post the link in the video description, correct? So guys, in this video, I'm going to use authorization code grant as well as the implicit grant. So let's start with the authorization code grant, and later I will show you the implicit grant. Okay. And then once you check this, this allowed OAuth scopes are enabled. So here we are not going to use the allowed OAuth scopes like default scopes. We will be using the custom scope. So I will check this. So guys, don't worry, we are going to come back here and we will play around with the scopes and we will see how it works. Okay. And we will say save changes. Now as a next step, we are going to create the temporary user. So click on user and groups under general settings, say create user. I will provide the username and I will uncheck this. I will provide the temporary password, test@123 for example. I will uncheck this and say create user. Now here we have successfully configured or created the user. Now as a next step, we are going to configure the JWT authorizer within API gateway, because now we have the issuer URL as well as the client ID. So navigate to API gateway, give the authorizer name. I will say JWT auth. Then we have identity source. So I'm going to leave it as it is. So what does it mean, that how you are going to pass the access token? So we are saying that we will pass the access token as a part of the header with the key authorization and the value as the access token. Okay. If you want to modify this, you can modify this. You can even say authorization token, but I will leave it as it is. And then we need to define the issuer URL. So the issuer URL is https Cognito IDP followed by the region. So you can change the region if you are in different region, but mine is US East 1, which would be followed by the / user pool ID. So from where we will get the user pool ID, so click on general settings. So here you will be able to see the user pool ID, copy that and paste it over here. So this is our issuer URL, and then we need to add the audience. So click on add audience, navigate to user pool, click on app clients, copy app client ID and paste it over here. Now once this configuration is done, click on create and attach. So here we have successfully configured the JWT authorizer. Then here you will be able to see the authorization scope. So I'm going to add the custom scope over here. That is, I will say add scope. I will navigate to user pool. I will say app client settings and I will copy this custom scope, correct? And I will paste it over here and we will say save. Okay. Now what we are going to do is we will deploy this API endpoint to custom stage or the manual stage, that is version 1, and we will say deploy to stage. So now we have successfully configured the JWT authorizer. We have deployed it. Now what's next? So the next step is to generate the access token, right? So here we are going to say launch hosted UI, and then we are going to log in with the same user that we have created. So I will enter the password, or you can also create the user by clicking on sign up. Okay. So here I will say test@123 sign in, and it will ask me to change the password. So I will set the new password, email, and I will say, so I think password is mismatched. Okay, now it looks good, and then we will say send. Now as soon as you click on send, you will be able to see the code over here in the URL. So this is basically the authorization code. Now using this code, we need to generate the access token, right? So to generate the access token, we are going to open Postman, okay? And then we are going to copy the domain URL that we have configured over here, that is domain name. And I'm going to copy this. I will paste it over here. I will simply reformat this. Now it looks good. Followed by /OAuth 2/token. So to generate the access token or to fetch the access token, we need to use this URL, right, with the post method. So I will select post over here and then click on body. Here we will select xwww form URL encoded, and here we are going to pass few parameters, that is the grant underscore type, which would be authorization underscore code. Correct. Then we have another parameter, that is client ID, client underscore ID. So we are going to copy and paste the client ID from here. Followed by the third parameter, which is redirect URI. So redirect URI we will copy from app client settings, that is google.com, followed by the authorization code that we have generated after logging in to the hosted UI. Okay, so that would be code followed by this authorization code that we are going to paste it over here, and then we will say send. Now as you can see, we have the access token as well as the refresh token, and the token type is bearer. Correct. Now we are going to use this access token to invoke our API endpoint successfully. So let's open a new tab and navigate to API gateway, click on stages. I'm going to use the default stage. So I will copy the invocation URL. I will paste it over here, followed by /test route that I want to invoke with the get method. So right now we will invoke this API endpoint without any configuration or without access token. So we will say send. Now as you can see, it returns status code 401, that is unauthorized. Now as a part of the header, we are going to pass authorization. Why authorization? Because if we look at the identity source, then we have configured authorization over here. Now if we have configured authorization token over here, then we need to pass authorization token over here. Okay, but right now it's authorization, and in the value we are going to copy and paste the access token that we have generated. Correct. So I'm going to copy this and paste it over here as a value, and I will say send. Now as you can see, it returns status code 200 and the invocation is successful using this access token, right? So if I don't pass the authorization header with the correct access token, then it's going to return 401 unauthorized. Or if I try to pass any other modified access token like ABC or something, and if I say send, then it will say 401 unauthorized. Okay, so this is how you can generate the access token while you are using authorization code grant. Now let's check one more thing. So what I'm going to do is I will navigate to user pools and I'm going to uncheck this custom scope, and instead I will say open ID, that is default scope, and I will say save changes. Okay, now I'm going to generate the authorization code by clicking on launch hosted UI, and then I'm going to log in, that is sign in as srcecde, and here I will get the new authorization code. Now let me copy this and paste it over here and generate the new access token. Okay, so I will say send, and then I'm going to copy this access token and I'm going to use this access token to invoke the API endpoint. So let's see what happens. So I will say send. Now as you can see, it says 403 forbidden. Why? Because the access token or the authorization code that we have generated is for the OpenID OAuth scope and not for the custom scope, that is test.read, right? And why that access token didn't work? Because within API gateway, if you look at the authorization scope, then we have configured it as test/test.read. So that's the reason this access token will not work. Now let me show you one more thing. Let's navigate to this post tab. Now if I try to reuse the authorization code and if I say send, then it will not allow, right? So you can use the authorization code only once to generate the access token, correct? So that's basically authorization code grant, and that is how you can secure your API endpoints using the JWT authorizer via authorization code grant. Now let's have a look at the implicit grant. So I'm going to uncheck this. I will check implicit grant. I will uncheck OpenID and I will check test.read and say save changes. Now I am going to say launch hosted UI. I'm going to sign in as the user. Now here, as you can see in the URL, we have the access token instead of the authorization code. Now we can directly use this access token to invoke our API endpoint. So I will navigate to Postman and paste it over here and I will say send. Correct. So while you are using implicit grant, then you will directly get the access token. But while you are using authorization code grant, then you will get the authorization code and then you need to use that authorization code to generate the access token, right? So within authorization code grant, you add one more layer of security, right? So basically you generate the authorization code, and if that authorization code is valid, then only you can generate the access token and use that access token to access your API endpoint, correct? Whereas in implicit grant, you directly get the access token, correct? So guys, apart from that, I also want to show you that how you can access the JWT parameters or the JWT claims within the Lambda function, right? So what we are going to do is we will click on routes, we will click on get, and we will say configure integration, and we are going to open this Lambda function. Okay. And I hope we have the print statement for the event. So here we have. So I will click on monitor and I will open view logs in CloudWatch. Now what happens is that after validating the JWT token, so basically after JWT authorizer validate the JWT token, API gateway passes the claims in the token to the API routes integration. So in my case, the API route integration is the Lambda function, right? And then within backend resources such as Lambda function, you can access the JWT claims. So let me quickly show you that. So let me open this log, and if we look at this event data, so here within request context, you would be able to see the authorizer, right? And within authorizer, you will get all the information regarding the authorization, right? That is JWT claims, client ID, event ID, scopes, username, and whatnot, right? So basically, if you want to access the claims within your backend integration, then this is how you can do that. So guys, that is how you can secure your API endpoints using authorization code grant or the implicit grants. So here what I have demoed is that we have configured the JWT authorizer, we have configured the Amazon Cognito to generate the access token, and using that access token we have invoked the API endpoint. Also we have looked at the custom scopes and the OAuth scopes, right? So that how it works and how we can generate the access token particular to the given custom scope, and how we can configure the authorization scopes within the API gateway itself, and how we can secure the API endpoints. So guys, that's all for this section. In this section, I will take you through how to verify and validate JWT access token via Lambda Authorizer within API Gateway. And then once the JWT access token is verified and validated, we should be able to provide access for the API endpoint that user is trying to access. So generally, HTTP API provides JWT as one of the authorizer types, and I have already done a video on the same, as you can see on my screen. So here I have this video, that is JWT authorizer with Amazon Cognito. Okay, but I have received a few requests to do a video on how to validate the JWT access token via custom Lambda authorizer. So basically that is something that we are going to cover in this video. So here we will be using AWS Cognito as auth service to generate the JWT access token and validate the same via custom Lambda authorizer. However, this implementation is not limited to HTTP API, and you can also implement it for the REST API in the same manner. Okay. And apart from that, I would like you to take note that I have already covered different auth supported by HTTP and REST APIs, which you can find on my channel's playlist section. So now we will get started with the creation of the Cognito user pool. Okay, since I mentioned that we will be using AWS Cognito as the auth service, followed by we will create the Lambda function that would be used as the Lambda authorizer. Followed by we will create a new route within the specific API gateway, as you can see on my screen, followed by some method, and then we are going to bind the Lambda authorizer with that route. And then we are going to fetch the access token and use that access token to basically authorize the request. Okay, so now let's get started with the creation of the Cognito user pool. So let's search for Cognito and click on that. Now once you are within Amazon Cognito, click on create user pool from the top right corner. Now as you can see, the user interface has been updated, but you can also switch back to the old console if you want, but we will move on with the updated user interface. Now here by default the Cognito user pool is selected under provider types, so we will move on with that. And here within Cognito user pool sign in option, we will check username, followed by under username requirements we will say allow users to sign in with the preferred username. Okay, and then we will say next. Now here within password policy, we will select Cognito defaults. Within multi-factor authentication, for now we will move on with the no multi-factor authentication, but as per your requirement you can select the option that is of interest. And then within user account recovery, we will leave everything as it is, and then we will click on next. Now again in step 3 we are not going to modify anything, and we will simply click on next. Now here within email, we will select send email with Cognito and then click on next. Now here you need to provide the user pool name. I would say access token pool, something like this. And then within hosted authentication pages, we will say that we want to use the Cognito hosted UI. And within domain, we are going to use a Cognito domain, but you can also use a custom domain if you want. Now here you need to enter the domain name. So I would simply say access auth, and it is available. Okay, so your domain would look something like accessauth.auth.region.amazoncognito.com. Okay, now here we have the client settings. So here within app type we will say public client, and here you need to provide the app client name. I would say app1. Within client secret, we are going to select don't generate a client secret, followed by the allowed callback URL. So I will simply say here google.com, followed by click on advanced app client settings. Now here we are going to leave authentication flow as it is and all this configuration as it is, and we will move on to the OAuth 2.0 grant types. Now here I am going to check implicit grant and uncheck the authorization code grant. With implicit grant, we will get the access token in the URL itself, but while we select authorization code grant, it basically returns the authorization code, and then we have to use that authorization code to fetch the access token. So to keep it simple and fetch the access token within the URL itself, we will check the implicit grant. But if you want to learn more about the authorization code grant and how to fetch the access token using that code, then you can refer to this video, that is JWT Authorizer with Amazon Cognito. That is the part 14 of this tutorial series. But for now, we will move on with the implicit grant. Now here within OpenID Connect scopes, we will only select OpenID over here. Now there could be a requirement to create the custom scopes as well, right? But that is something that you can create after the creation of the user pool. Okay, so now let's click on next, and then we will say create user pool. Now here we have successfully created the access token pool, that is the user pool. Now here, as you can see, this is the new interface that we are dealing with, and there is a users tab, and from there we can create the user. I will simply say srccde, and within invitation message I will say don't send an invitation. Okay, and then I am going to set a temporary password, and finally we will say create user. So here we have successfully created one user, but you can always click on this app integration and click on this app client and analytics, and you can say view hosted UI, and here you can always click on sign up to create the new user. Okay, but by default I have created one user so that I can use that username and password to sign in within this hosted UI. So now let's go back to the access token pool. Now here we have groups, then sign in experience if you want to modify anything like password policy or multi-factor authentication and whatnot. And then here we have sign up experience. So here you can kind of set few attributes if you want. Then we have messaging, and what we are interested in is app integration. Okay, so here we have the resource server. So if you want to create the custom scopes, then you have to configure the resource server. But at this point of time, I'm not going to configure the resource server. We are simply going to use the OpenID scope. Okay, and then here we have app client defaults, where you can basically customize the hosted UI, then configure the security, and then here we have the list of the app clients. Now here we have created only one app client, that is app1, so we are going to click on that, and here we have all the information that we need. You can also click on view hosted UI as I just did, and here you would be able to see the OAuth grant types as well as the custom scopes or the OpenID scopes. Okay, so here we have successfully created the Cognito user pool, and now as the next step we are going to create the Lambda function, which we are going to use as the Lambda authorizer. So search for Lambda and navigate to Lambda management console. Now once you are within Lambda management console, click on create function from the top right corner, give the name. I would say Lambda authorizer, and then I will select runtime as Python 3.9, and within permission I will say create a new role with basic Lambda permission, and then click on create function. Now here we have successfully created the Lambda authorizer function. Now as a next step, we need to update this code in order to verify and validate the JWT access token. So for that, I have already pushed the code on this repository, that is AWS tutorial code. Okay, and I will paste the link of this in the video description. So this is how the code looks like. So let me copy this and go back to Lambda authorizer and paste it over here. I will say save and deploy. Now here we are using one additional package that does not comes pre-installed within AWS Lambda runtime. Okay, that is JWT. So for that I have created the Lambda layers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the Lambda layer to this Lambda function. So scroll down to layers and click on add a layer. Now here I will select custom layers, and from the drop down I will say PyJWT crypto, and the version is 1, and then say add. Now if you want to use the same package to create the Lambda layers, then what you can do is you can navigate to this repository, that is AWS tutorial code, and you can look for Lambda layer package. Okay, so here it is. You can click on that and you should be able to see a zip file, that is pygwt crypto underscore 39.zip. You can download this file, and then using this zip file you can create the Lambda layer package for pygwt. So now moving back to the Lambda function. So here we have successfully configured the Lambda layer package. Now as a next step, I will quickly take you through this code at the very high level. So here from line number 10 to line number 13, we are importing the necessary packages that we need to execute this code successfully. Now from line number 16 to line number 21, we are fetching a few values from the environment variables, right? So here we are fetching the region and then the user pool ID that we have just created. So as a next step, after going through this code, we are going to set this environment variable so that we can fetch the value from there. So user pool ID is something that we have just created. And then we have the URL on line number 18. So here we have defined the URL, that is Cognito IDP URL. and this is the URL that we are going to use to download JWKS file. Okay, now what is JWKS? So basically JWKS stands for JSON Web Key Set, and the JSON Web Key Set is a set of keys containing the public keys used to verify any JSON Web Token, that is JWT, issued by the authorization server. In this case it's Cognito, and it is signed using the RS-256 signing algorithm. So this is the URL to basically download or fetch the JWKS file. And then on line number 21 we are fetching the app client ID that again we have just configured within the user pool. Okay, and on line number 24 we are fetching the JWKS file using PyJWT client. Okay, so here we are using PyJWT package, that is the Python package to deal with the JWT stuff. Okay, so here we will get the JWKS file within this JWKS underscore client, and then we have the error handling in here. Followed by here we have a custom method that is return response. So here we are basically defining a response that we want to return. Okay, so here we are saying is authorized, it could be true or false, and within context we can pass on additional parameters. Okay, so this is the helper method to basically return a response. Now on line number 38 we are fetching the access token from the event of headers of authorization. So we will have the token that the user is going to pass within this variable, that is on line number 38, that is the token variable. Now here on line number 41 we are checking the token structure. So we are splitting the token into three parts using the dot as a separator. Now if the length of that token is not equal to 3, then we are returning a response saying the user is not authorized to invoke or call the particular endpoint. Okay, now if you want to understand the JWT token structure, then you can again follow this video on my channel, that is JWT structure. So here I have did a quick animation which will explain that how the JWT token looks like and how it is formed. Now coming back to the Lambda function, now here on line number 49 we are fetching the headers from the token. Okay, so that is something that we will need at later point of time, followed by fetching the signing key from the token using the get signing key from JWT method. And then on line number 53 we are using the decode method to validate the token, right? So here we are basically asking it to verify the signature, verify the expiration, verify the issued ad, verify the identity of the token, followed by the verify underscore AUD option that I have set as false, because while we are dealing with the access token it will not have the AUD parameter that stands for the audience, but instead it will have the client underscore ID parameter. So audience is something that we are going to verify in later part of the code explicitly. So here basically we are validating the token, and here we have the exception handling for the different errors or different exception. And now moving on to the line number 89. So here, as I mentioned, here we are explicitly verifying the audience. So here we are checking if app client is not equal to the client ID that we get in the JWT access token, then we are saying the user is not authorized. Okay, so here we will verify the audience, and then on line number 97 we are checking the token use parameter, right? So here we are checking if the token use value is access or not. So if you are expecting the access token, then you can compare it with the access value. If you are expecting the ID token, then you can check if token use is equal to ID token or not. Okay, so here in this case we are expecting the access token. So if it is not equal to the access token, then again we are returning the false response. And finally on line number 105 we are checking the scope. So we are validating the scope. So here in this case I am checking if OpenID scope is present in the token or not, right? But as for your requirement, you can also modify this value, that what you are looking for is a part of the scope. And same goes for the token use check. So if you are expecting the ID token, then you can modify this value as per your requirement. Okay, so this is the basically high level code walkthrough that how we are validating and verifying the JWT access token. Now as the next step, we are going to set few environment variables, that is the user pool ID and the app client ID. Okay, so let's go ahead and configure that. So let's navigate to the configuration and scroll down to the environment variables and then click on edit. Now here we will click on add environment variable. So within key I will copy from here. So here I will say user pool ID and I will paste it over here as a key. Now the user pool ID you will get from the your user pool that we have just created. So here within user pool overview you would be able to see user pool ID. So copy that and paste it over here. Followed by we have to add one more environment variable, that is the app client ID. So I'm going to copy that and paste it over here. And app client ID you will get from again the access token pool. Within app integration, scroll down to your apps, and here you would be able to see the client ID. So you can copy that and again paste it over here, and then we will say save. Now here we have successfully configured the Cognito user pool and the Lambda authorizer. Now as the next step, we will go to the HTTP API that is over here, and here we will click on routes from the left panel, and here I will create a new route. So I will select any method, and then I would say lam auth, something like this. So this is the route that we want to call, and then I will say create. Now here we should be able to see the route where it is. Here it is, right? So that is lam auth, okay, with the any method. So now we need to click on this any method, and then first we will integrate the lambda function. So I'm going to say attach integration, and here I will say create and attach an integration, and within integration tab I would say lambda function, and here I'm going to select this HTTP API lambda function. So here within this lambda function, we are simply looking that which method user is using. Okay, so if user invokes the API endpoint with the post method, then we will return post method invoked, and if the user is invoking the API endpoint with the get method, then we will return get method invoked. Okay, so it's very simple lambda function, so we are going to use that as a part of the backend integration for that specific route that we have created. Okay, so I'm going to select that, and then I will leave rest of the option as it is, and I will say create. Now here we have successfully attached the lambda function as a part of the backend integration for this method. Okay, that is any method. Now let's go back to routes again and click on that any method, and then here we are going to attach authorization. Okay, now here we will say create and attach an authorizer. Now here within authorizer type we have two options. So here we will move on with the lambda function. Okay, and I will give a name. I would say JWT auth, and here we need to select the lambda function that is going to perform the authorization or going to perform the validation of the access token. So in our case it's lambda authorizer. Okay, so I'm going to select that, and payload format version I will say 2.0, and response mode I will say simple, and I'm going to disable the authorizer caching. Now if you want to learn about the simple and the IAM policy mode, then you can again go back to this tutorial series. So here I have covered Lambda authorizer with simple response mode and the Lambda authorizer with IAM policy response mode. Okay, so in this case we will move on with the simple response mode, and within identity sources we will leave it as it is, that is request.header.authorization, and finally we will say create and attach. So it says authorizer name must be unique. So I think I need to modify the name. So I would say JWT auth lamb, followed by I need to select the lambda authorizer again. Okay, I will disable authorizer caching, and then I will say create and attach. So here as you can see we have successfully configured the authorization, that is the lambda authorizer for the specific route and the specific method. Okay, so if we click on routes, you should be able to see that authorization and integration are configured successfully. So now I think we are all set to invoke this API endpoint. So I'm going to click on stages, and I'm going to use the default invocation URL or the default stage. So I'm going to copy this, go to Postman, paste it over here, slash followed by the route that I want to invoke. So the route name is lam auth. So let me copy that, and I'm going to select get method over here, and simply I will say send. So here as you can see it returns status code 401, that is unauthorized. Okay, that means we need to pass the JWT access token in order to successfully invoke this API endpoint. So now to fetch the access token, we will go back to the user pool, that is access token pool that we have created as a part of the first step, and we are going to click on this app client, and then here you would be able to see the button that is view hosted UI. So I'm going to click on that. Now here I'm going to log in using the existing username and password that I have configured while creating the user pool, that is srcecde with the respective password. But you can also go ahead and click on sign up to create the new user, and then I will say sign in. Now here it will ask to set the new password, so let me set it. And I will enter the email and say send. Now here, as you can see in the URL, I have this ID token, and somewhere after that I should be able to see the access token. Okay, so let me say never. So maybe let me copy this and paste it in Sublime. So copy, paste, and let me search for access token. So here, as you can see, here we have the access token. Okay, so I can copy that. So here basically we will get two tokens, that is the ID token and the access token, right? Since we have selected the scope as the open ID. So that's the reason we have the ID token and the access token. So here what we are interested in is the access token. So let's copy this access token, go back to Postman, click on headers, and within key we will mention authorization, and we are going to paste the value over here, and then we will say send. Now here, as you can see, it returns status code 200 with the success message saying get method invoked. Now if I were to modify this token, so let me add a letter Q at the end and say send. So as you can see, it returns status code 403 forbidden. Okay, since this token is modified. Now if I undo that modification and say send, now as you can see, we are successfully able to invoke that API endpoint. So guys, that's all for this section. Thanks for watching the full hands-on video on Amazon HTTP API authorization, and I hope that you find it helpful. And finally, I will request you to please like, share and subscribe to my channel, and see you next time. Thanks for watching.